Today's speaker. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Taylor Hargrove. Dr. Hargrove is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and a faculty fellow at the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her program of research examines how and why social inequalities in health unfold across the life course, focusing on inequalities by race, ethnicity, skin color, gender, and socioeconomic status. Her current program of research integrates biomedical perspectives into the study of health inequality in the United States by exploring linkages among sociogeographic context, individual level characteristics, and biological measures of health in early adulthood. So the goal of this work is to elucidate how macro level environments shape the consequences of social statuses or more proximate causes of poor health. Dr. Hargrove plans to continue this line of research in efforts to clarify the pathways through which social factors get under our skin to shape health and undergird social stratification. So we are really excited to have you today. Dr. Hargrove would prefer to take questions at the end, unless there are, some clarifying questions. But as you think of questions during the talk, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will fill them during the Q&A session right after the talk. So take it away, Dr. Hargrove.
Thanks so much, Courtney. And thank you all very much for having me here. I'm really excited to be giving this talk today and getting your feedback on a relatively newer project that I've been working on. So let me go ahead and share my screen before we get too far. Okay. So hopefully you can all see my slides. And so today, like I said, it's a newer project that explores the linkages among self-identified race, skin color, racial contexts, and health. And so I'm going to be presenting one set of results from the overall project, and really looking forward to our discussion at the end and any kind of potential feedback or advice you might have for moving forward. Okay. So here's just a quick outline of what I'm hoping to get through with you all today. So I just want to give you a little bit of background on my work overall and kind of where this particular project is fitting in within my program of research that Dr. Thomas Tobin just described. And then I'll get into the motivation for this specific paper, briefly go over the data and methods, and then get into the results and a few concluding thoughts. So my research overall has sought to address these links between multiple disadvantaged social statuses and health inequalities at different stages of life. And I've utilized several approaches to better understand these complex patterns. And one approach involves applying an intersectionality perspective. So the idea is to challenge this assumption that racial, ethnic, gender, and socioeconomic inequalities operate independently of one another, and that the nature of these inequalities are invariant across age or across stage of the life course. And some of my other work takes a more explicit within-group approach to study health among Black Americans in particular in order to uncover unique pathways to health. And so with this approach, I examined sources of intragroup heterogeneity among Black Americans, really focusing on gender and skin tone. And identifying this type of heterogeneity within groups, as well as the unique pathways that it produces, really helps us contradict these assumed monolithic social experiences among members of similarly defined and situated racial groups. And as Dr. Thomas Tobin also mentioned, one of my ongoing goals has been to expand this research agenda more fully by integrating social contexts and biomedical perspectives into the study of health inequality, particularly racial inequalities. And so part of this effort culminated in a project funded by the NIH, along with my co-PI, Dr. Lauren Gaydosh, who is an assistant professor of sociology at UT Austin. And the project sought to study the socio-contextual and biological mechanisms linking social mobility to health. And so more specifically, we aim to contribute to this growing evidence that upward social mobility is linked to worse physiological health, yet better psychosocial health among Black Americans. And scholars in this very room have contributed a lot to this body of work. And so with the piecing together of physiological outcomes and psychosocial outcomes, this pattern has generally been referred to as skin deep resilience, as scholars often cite resiliency as a primary driver of these patterns, right? So really arguing that measures of resilience are good for psychosocial outcomes, but might undermine physical health. And so here's just an example of what skin deep resilience looks like more empirically. And so these are results from a study by Gregory Miller and colleagues among a sample of low socioeconomic rural African Americans in Georgia. And so this figure is displaying a measure of epigenetic aging there on the x-axis by adolescent disadvantage and assessments of self-control, which the researchers frame as a form of resiliency, right? Given that it's a characteristic that facilitates success in academic settings and includes traits like grit or perseverance. And so what they found is that epigenetic aging was occurring faster among individuals from the most disadvantaged adolescent backgrounds who also exhibited high levels of self-control. So this red bar towards the right. But these same individuals report the lowest levels of depressive symptoms across the age range of 17 to 20. And so the same individuals are depicted in the purple line that you can see at the bottom. Another more recent-ish example comes from a 2018 publication by Lauren Gaydosh and colleagues that used the AdHealth data, which I use for the specific project I'll talk about today. And so on the x-axis here is an index of adolescent disadvantage, which is comprised of several factors across neighborhood, family, and school domains. And then on the y-axis is the probability of having metabolic syndrome, which is the summary score of several physiological risks. And so what they found is that for white respondents, upward mobility, which was defined as coming from a disadvantaged background, so these higher values on the adolescent advantage index, and achieving a college education or higher, so individuals depicted in the dotted trajectory, is generally associated with a reduced risk of metabolic syndrome relative to those who do not attain a college degree, even though the interaction between college, educational attainment and adolescent disadvantage wasn't statistically significant. But for non-Hispanic Black and US-born Hispanic respondents, there's actually this increased risk of metabolic syndrome for those who are upwardly mobile. So again, looking at individuals who followed the trajectory of the dotted line, where individuals coming from high levels on the adolescent disadvantage index and go on to attain a college degree or more, experience this highest risk of or increased probability of metabolic syndrome. And yet we see this exact opposite pattern when we're looking at depressive symptoms, such that upward mobility is actually associated with fewer depressive symptoms for Black and Hispanic respondents who were upwardly mobile relative to their counterparts who were not upwardly mobile and came from similar backgrounds. And so collectively, evidence suggests that the mobility-health relationship may operate differently for Black Americans and to a certain extent US-born Hispanic Americans compared to whites. And so the hypothesized mechanisms linking mobility to poor physical health have been these individual level psychosocial and behavioral factors, such as stressors of the mobility experience, for example, aspirations that could go unmet, expectations one has of socioeconomic achievement that again could or could not be met. But we argued that we know less about, one, how the surrounding context in which mobility occurs may shape the development of these individual level behaviors and expectations, or the experience of the mobility process itself. And then second, we also know less about whether biological risk factors interact with social factors to influence the relationship between mobility and health. And so this is where our project came in. We really wanted to evaluate the social and biological mechanisms that underlie these relationships among race, mobility, and health among a diverse array of population subgroups. So also moving past just considering white and Black racial groups. And so to do this, we proposed to merge on new contextual data to the AdHealth study, as well as get additional biological markers of inflammation and immune functioning. And so I'm going to put in a shameless plug for these new data that the contextual data are now available for AdHealth users and the biological data are coming. But here's a list of what will be or is already available that has come from this project. And so in terms of the new contextual data, we merged on county level and state level information from Opportunity Insights, which has data on mobility, right? The degree to which counties allow for mobility, information from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the RWJF County Health Rankings, Kaiser Family Foundation State Health Facts, and information on tobacco tax. And so these data are really characterizing the demographic, socioeconomic, health, and mobility characteristics of the environments of AdHealth respondents in early life, in young adulthood, and at the beginning of midlife. So most of these measures have emerged onto waves 1, 4, and 5 of AdHealth. And then we also updated some of the existing contextual data from the ACS, Climate Atlas, and the Uniform Crime Reports. So we can have more consistency in the types of measures that are available across the different waves of AdHealth. And then in terms of the biological data, we used the archived dried blood spots, an assay, then sent them out for assay for these additional markers of inflammation, right? So these cytokines of IL-6, IL-8, IL-10, and TNF alpha, as well as an additional marker of immune functioning, which is CMV. And I'm happy to talk more about these data during the Q&A if anyone's interested. And so I just want to present a quick example of how we've used these data so far. And so in a paper that recently came out in Demography, my co-authors and I examined differences in the association between education and health, not only by race ethnicity, but also by characteristics of the counties that respondents lived in during childhood and adolescence. And these county characteristics included things like opportunities for upward mobility, investments in residents' health and education, and the educational attainment of county residents. And so what we found, right, similar to prior work, is that higher education was not associated with better health. In this case, a reduction in cardiometabolic risk, which is another indicator of physiological health, among Black respondents. So that second column there on the screen. But higher education was linked to better health, right? This reduction in CMR for all other racial ethnic groups, including white, US-born Hispanic, and foreign-born Hispanic respondents. But we saw a bit of a different story when examining these associations across different county contexts. And so I know this is probably very busy coming up on your screens, but basically we had 12 contexts that were characterized by high or low levels of economic, policy, and social advantages that you can see here on the various y-axes. And so what we found was that out of these 12 contexts, there were only 3 in which Black young adults had, with higher levels of education, experienced similar reductions in cardiometabolic risk as whites with a similar level of education, right? And these were counties that were characterized by a high amount of opportunity for upward mobility, high per capita spending on education, and high per capita spending on health and hospitals, right? So again, in these contexts, Black respondents received similar health returns to higher levels of education as their white counterparts. In the other 9 contexts, Black young adults experienced either smaller or no improvements in health at higher levels of education compared to their white counterparts. And so in this paper, we also do further within group analyses, so looking within racial ethnic groups. And these analyses showed that for minoritized racial and ethnic young adults, the relationship between education and cardiometabolic risk was more dependent on the characteristics of early life counties, right? Whereas for white adults, those with higher education experience improvements in health, regardless of the type of county that they lived in early life. And so these findings really highlight the role of early life contexts in differentially shaping the association between educational attainment and health for different racial ethnic groups in the US, right? Which leads, I think, nicely to the specific paper that I'm going to talk more about today, which doesn't actually use the new contextual data that I just spent a lot of time talking about, but is still within this theme of contextualizing health disparities, right? And so the overall purpose of the project is twofold. The first is to investigate how self-identified race and interviewer-rated skin color shape health and the nature of health inequality between Black and white Americans across adulthood, and to explore the extent to which relationships among skin color, race, skin color, and health vary depending on the broader social context. And the broader social context here being the school, and the health outcome for this paper being depressive symptoms. Okay, so just a little bit of motivation for this particular paper. One, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of depressive symptoms and studying mental health more broadly. And so one reason they're becoming, I think, increasingly important to study is their potential for these implications for mortality, right? So if we buy into this argument that midlife mortality rates might be raising due to the deaths of despair, right? So death from suicide, alcohol use, and drug poisonings. We know that all racial groups, at least among a recent cohort of young adults, are experiencing rises in despair, right, as captured by mental health and substance use, right? So there's evidence of increasing or worsening mental health among recent cohorts that could be linked to increased mortality. Other reasons include the economic burden associated with depression and depressive symptoms. So for example, we know that the US economy spent about $210 billion on depression-related costs in 2010. And then of course, there are significant social and personal burdens attributed to depressive symptoms, such as poor physical and mental health outcomes, diminished socioeconomic achievement, and reduced quality of social and familial relationships, which all, of course, can affect one's quality of life. And so we know that the burden of mental health is not experienced equally, right? So more specifically, Black Americans, particularly younger Black Americans, tend to experience more depressive symptoms than their white counterparts. And these inequalities are projected to only get worse given the events over the past year and a half, 2 years, right? So thinking about the pandemic and the various social movements for racial justice. So for example, recent data from weekly surveys of US households collected by the Census Bureau showed that Black Americans experienced the highest increase in anxiety and depressive symptoms since 2019. So rising to about 30 to 34% among Black Americans. And that part of this increase was due to the multiple instances of police brutality that went viral, right? So for example, these same data showed that the spike in anxiety and depressive symptoms among Black Americans followed the viral spread of the video of George Floyd's killing, right? And so overall, depressive symptoms, especially across the life course, are something that we really need to be keeping track of. So then the question becomes, what's missing from this line of work, right? And so first, there's been less attention to the role of early life contexts in shaping trends in depressive symptoms, right? So Prior work has provided considerable evidence for the long arm of childhood, or the ability of early life conditions to shape developmental trajectories and patterns of advantage and disadvantage, even after controlling for adult contexts and experiences. And these trajectories and patterns of disadvantage ultimately influence health via the accumulation of risks and resources, right? And that can go on to influence individuals' ability to cope with risk or capitalize on resources. And we also know that racial contexts, right, which are a result of historical and contemporary forms of structural racism, matter for health, right? So more specifically, racial contexts have been shown to differentially influence health both across social groups and within similar social groups. And so when we're thinking about important early life contexts for later life health, schools become one of the more obvious choices, right? And so importantly, schools can contribute to the reproduction of racial inequalities as they constitute racialized organizations, right? So drawing on the work of Victor Ray in his 2019 ASR piece, right? So thinking about racialized organizations as organizations whose rules and distributions of social and material resources are influenced by racial schemas or ideologies of subordination and superiority. Right. So for example, when it comes to schools, we can think about these debates over critical race theory, or what people think or assume critical race theory is in schools, but kind of the broader picture of how curriculums become established, right? Curriculums that can ignore or perhaps misapply the history or experiences of minoritized groups, both globally and in the US. We also know that certain forms of capital, particularly cultural capital, help students succeed in school, as well as on their future socioeconomic trajectories, right? So here we can think about Annette Lareau's work and her arguments that middle-class families can align their practices and parenting styles with school requirements or reward systems within the school. Schools also enforce policies that separate racial groups from one another. So a big example of this being tracking, academic tracking, which can further segregate students within schools and provide different education experiences, right? So there's been a recent push to address these inequalities in school district from a federal government level, right? So addressing inequalities in academic tracking. And then lastly, schools expose students to discrimination from other students, from teachers, and from administrators, right? So one example of this comes from data collected in 2017 that showed during the 2016 to 17 academic school year, the country's two largest school districts, so in New York and Los Angeles, suspended or expelled students for a total of over 47,000 days, right? But these forms of discipline were disproportionately experienced among Black students, who, for example, made up 27% of New York school district enrollment, yet accounted for 47% of the days lost from suspension. Right, so taking all of this collectively, schools are really these engines that can reinforce and create drastic inequalities and future life chances. So one way to try to capture the impacts or long-term consequences of schools is by examining patterns of health among students who attend schools characterized by different racial contexts or racial compositions. So here, really thinking about the types of schools that may heighten exposure to discrimination for minority students, or may facilitate the development of psychosocial resources to cope with hardships across the life course. And so there have been several studies linking racial composition of schools to health in adulthood, but few have examined association with trajectories of health across adulthood, particularly mental health. But one important exception is a study conducted by Katrina Walsman, Bethany Bell, and Bridget Gooseby in 2011. And so they used 4 ways of ad health data and examined the relationship between the percentage of white students at a given school and trajectories of depressive symptoms across adolescence and young adulthood. And they found that as the percentage of white students increased, Black students reported more depressive symptoms, right? And their findings also indicated that the effect of racial composition did not vary by age, suggesting that Black and white students experienced similar rates of change in depressive symptoms across young adulthood. It was just that Black students had these higher initial levels of depressive symptoms. And so I see myself extending these findings in two major ways. The first is thinking about how other dimensions of race or inequality might differentiate some of these relationships. Right, so we know that race and racial structures are multidimensional and they're highly dynamic. And more specifically, race itself is a multidimensional concept that's comprised of several different indicators, one being self-identity, self-classification, phenotype, racial ancestry, etc. And it's possible that the indicators most significant or most relevant for health can change over time, given changes to racial hierarchies and structures. But a majority of health disparities research employs a self-identification variable, right, which infers race from the respondent's choice of identity from a set of predefined categories. And while I'm not knocking this, this certainly has produced valuable information regarding racial inequalities in health, and a lot of times one of the only measures that we have to assess race and try to get this proxy for racism. It really only captures one aspect of stratification processes. And so there are other important dimensions of race that often go overlooked or are not available. And one such dimension is skin color, right? Even though research has long found that skin complexion significantly structures access to opportunities and desired resources among racial and ethnic minority groups. And this unequal distribution of resources based on skin color is generally referred to as colorism, right? Which, similar to racism, is this ideological and structural system of inequality that affords special advantages to lighter skinned individuals because of their closer phenotypic resemblance and closer presumed genetic similarity to Europeans. And therefore, they're thought to better embody these Eurocentric standards of beauty, morality, intellect, status, competence, and the like. And so these advantages translate into observed skin color stratification across a variety of life chances. And I'll just give you a few examples. One comes from an example of hourly wages. So seeing that compared to whites, Blacks as a whole tend to make 16% less in hourly wages, but that the magnitude of that difference varies by skin color, such that lighter skinned Black Americans make only 8% less than their white counterparts, compared to medium and dark skinned Black Americans who make about 17% less than their white counterparts. We also see this in school suspension, where those of students of darker skin are more likely to be suspended than their lighter skinned counterparts. And this occurs for both boys and girls. So thinking about the implications of these disruptions to one's education and how that can structure future opportunities for socioeconomic achievement or just the achievement of different life chances. And then we also see this within the criminal justice system, right? So here we're looking at disparities in prison sentences among Black and white adults who are convicted of the same crime. And what we're seeing, right, similar to the prior slides, is that compared to whites on a whole, Black individuals served many more days for the same crime than their white counterparts, but that again, this disparity was dependent on skin color, such that lighter skin Black individuals served comparable amounts of days in prison, right? Their prison sentence was more comparable than their medium and dark-skinned counterparts who experienced the brunt of this disproportionate prison sentence. And so all of these types of inequalities in life chances culminate into inequalities in health, right? With studies documenting health disadvantages of darker skinned Black adults relative to their lighter skin and white counterparts. But we know less about whether skin tone disparities vary across adulthood, and particularly in terms of their mental health. And second way I see this project extending previous work is by examining the extent to which early life contexts shape trajectories of health by both race and skin tone. Right. So prior work suggests that surrounding racial context shape the meanings and consequences of race and skin tone, particularly for Black Americans. So for example, the heterogeneous race model, which was first developed and put forth by Aaron Celius and Daphne Oyserman in 2001, argues that skin tone will have different meanings and significance in settings that are exclusively in-group. So in this case, in predominantly Black schools, than it will in interracial or predominantly out-group settings. So in this case, predominantly white or non-Black schools. Right, and so it makes sense that skin color has different meanings across these spaces, right? Given the history behind colorism and how it's been experienced among the Black population in terms of privilege and disadvantage. So for example, in the case of dark brown skin, right? This has traditionally been considered a negative attribute by both whites and other Black Americans, right? So we might expect darker skinned Black Americans to receive worse treatment from both whites and other Black individuals. But while those of lighter brown skin complexions might be treated more favorably by whites, they may also experience forms of unfair treatment from other Black Americans because they're less readily perceived as members of the Black community, right? And they could be treated as such. And those of medium brown skin tone might be less stigmatized in majority Black contexts, right? Because these individuals represent this prototypic Black phenotype, right? So the kind of physical characteristics we would expect or that we think about when we're thinking about a Black American. But because medium Black skin tones aren't associated with negative characteristics that have been assigned to their light and dark skin counterparts within the Black community, right? They might have easier or more favorable interactions within settings that are predominantly Black, right? And so in this way, it might afford medium-skinned Black Americans this type of protection when living in or navigating Black spaces, right? But how these dynamics might translate into differences in health is still a bit unclear. So I know I just threw a lot at you, so I'm going to try to bring it back together and remind you of the main research objectives of this project. And the first is to investigate the extent to which race and skin color differentially influence depressive symptoms and inequalities in depressive symptoms between Black and white young adults, and to assess whether the health consequences of race and skin color depend on racial context experience in early life. So I used data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, better known as AdHealth, which was originally designed to study the effects of the social contexts of adolescent life on the health and behavior of adolescents and their outcomes in adulthood. And so these are nationally representative data that were collected that were first collected in 1994 and 1995 when respondents were in grades 7 to 12. So they were between the ages of 12 and 20 years old. And 4 waves of follow-up data have been conducted spanning the years of 1996 to 2018. And so I draw on data from all 5 waves of ad health data, which span collectively ages 12 to 42. But the analytic sample is restricted to US-born women and men who self-identify as white or as African-American or Black. And I'm happy to talk about why these restrictions were made in the Q&A. Additionally, if the respondent identified as Black, they also had to have a valid measure on the skin color variable. In terms of the outcome, there were 4 items that were measured across all 5 waves. And I picked these 4 items to use because they're part of a set of 5 items that have been shown to be invariant across race, ethnicity, and immigrant generation, making them more ideal measures to contrast and compare racial groups. And so respondents were asked how frequently they experienced each symptom in the past 7 days, ranging from 0, never or rarely, to 3, most of the time. And so responses were reverse coded when necessary and summed across the items. So again, I'm interested in looking at the consequences of self-identified race and interviewer-rated skin color. The race measure comes from wave 1 of ad health, and interviewer-rated skin color comes from wave 3. This was the only time that ad health asked interviewers to rate the skin complexion of respondents. And they were asked to rate the complexion according to 5 categories, which included black, dark brown, medium brown, light brown, and white. Right? And there are very few Black respondents in the white skin color category. So I combined the 2 lightest categories. And so skin color was also only considered among Black respondents, 1, for theoretical reasons, but 2, there wasn't enough variation in skin color among white respondents, right? So we ended up with 4 skin color categories listed here. And then school racial composition, right? So this proxy for racial context was taken from wave 1. Again, when respondents were ages 12 to 20. And we're looking at both the proportion of Black students, non-Hispanic Black students at respondent schools, and the proportion of non-Hispanic white students. And so each of these measures are centered at medians to kind of help with interpretation. And then all of the models controlled for several individual, family, and school level characteristics listed here. So things like gender, parental education, or household receipt of welfare, school disadvantage, the urbanicity of the school, size, et cetera. In terms of the analyses, I use random coefficient multi-level models that are estimated within a mixed model framework to examine these trends in depressive symptoms across ages 12 to 42. And so these models estimate random effects for the intercept, in addition to fixed effects of covariates, right? And so these models are able to account for person-specific errors or unobserved differences between individuals that are stable over time and not accounted for by the covariates, right? So put more simply, able to account for unobserved heterogeneity. And so person-specific intercepts, right, these initial values of depressive symptoms and slopes, or the rate of change, are estimated in these models and describe intra-individual patterns of change in depressive symptoms as a function of age. So these are age-based trajectories rather than wave-based. And so the model fit indices suggested that a cubic growth trend with random intercepts and random quadratic slopes provided the best fit to the data. And the covariates are interacted with linear age only because model fit didn't really improve when interacting the covariates with higher order age terms. And so in efforts to be parsimonious, only covariates are only interacted with linear age. And so of primary interest were these interactions between linear age, school racial composition, and race and skin color. And so it's the interaction amongst these variables that I'll be presenting today. Okay, so moving on to the results. So what I'm going to show you first are just the initial trajectories of depressive symptoms. So these trajectories by race and skin color that only include controls in the model, right? So not accounting for school racial composition. And so consistent with prior work, right, that by Walsman, Bell, and Gooseby, on average, Black respondents tended to report more initial depressive symptoms than whites, and follow similar age patterns across adulthood, right? So seeing pretty parallel and consistent disparities across ages 12 to 42. So this plot further disaggregates Black respondents by skin tone. And here we get a bit of a different story. So at the bottom in blue, we see the trajectory of depressive symptoms for whites. Again, following a relatively advantaged trajectory, being the lowest out of all other groups. But Black respondents rated as having very dark skin, so this red line that you see, actually begin with similar levels of depressive symptoms as whites down here, but experience the slowest rate of decrease across this early part of adulthood. Such that this group ends up having the highest levels of depressive symptoms by the mid-30s. But on the other hand, Black respondents rated as having light, medium, or dark brown skin begin with higher initial levels of depressive symptoms, yet experience this faster decline in symptoms during their 20s, right? And so their trajectories ultimately converge with trajectories for white respondents in the late 30s, early 40s. And so we see some heterogeneity going on among Black respondents here, right? So the next set of trajectories I'm going to show you are looking at depressive symptoms for Black and white respondents who go to schools with different proportions of Black students. And so these are the trajectories that are based on that three-way interaction between race, school composition, and age. So to illustrate the findings, I'm going to show trajectories for students in schools with high and low proportions of Black students. And high and low are determined by one standard deviation below the mean and one standard deviation above the mean. So what we're seeing here is first that Black respondents who attended schools with low proportions of Black students, so this green line, experienced no decrease really in depressive symptoms across the first part of the age range. So down here, it's pretty flat. And they also ended up experiencing the highest levels of depressive symptoms out of the other groups. And we can compare this to Black respondents who attended schools with higher proportions of Black students. So this yellow line, who experienced steeper declines in depressive symptoms across the teen and early 20 ages. And they had lower levels of depressive symptoms by their early 30s, right? Despite having higher initial levels of depressive symptoms. White respondents who went to high proportion Black schools, so individuals in following this red trajectory, had lower levels of initial symptoms, but experienced pretty steady increases in symptoms across adulthood, such that they converged with the amount of depressive symptoms among Black respondents attending high proportion Black schools. And then similar to prior work, right, white respondents who went to low proportion Black schools experienced the most favorable trajectories in depressive symptoms. Okay, so now we're going to look at trajectories among those attending high proportion Black schools, but with, again, the Black subsample further disaggregated by skin tone, right? So we see the trajectory for whites here in blue. And what the results suggest is that for those attending schools with higher proportions of Black students, Black respondents rated as having very dark brown skin tone, so again, this red line, experienced shallower decreases in symptoms across adolescence and early adulthood compared to the other skin color groups. And so again, similar to the first plot we saw by skin color, it's this very dark, individuals rated as having very dark skin that experienced pretty high levels of depressive symptoms towards the end of this age range. Similar to that of their white counterparts who also attended higher proportion Black schools. Respondents rated as having very light skin, so this light blue line, have the highest initial levels of depressive symptoms, but follow similar age trajectories as their medium and darker skin counterparts who are depicted in these green and yellow lines here. And so basically all skin color groups, with the exception of those rated as having very dark brown skin, experience fewer depressive symptoms by the early 30s if they attended schools with higher proportions of Black students. And so these are the same trajectories, but among individuals who attended low proportion Black schools. So here again, we see that white respondents had the most advantaged trajectories out of all of the groups. And respondents rated as having light brown skin start off with the highest level of depressive symptoms, but experience relatively steeper decreases in depressive symptoms across the 20s and 30s, but still ending up with higher levels of depressive symptoms than their white counterparts. Whereas all other skin color groups follow a similar trajectory, in which they begin with similar levels of depressive symptoms here and experience more gradual increases in symptoms with age. Okay, so next we're going to see the same set of plots, except they're examining relationships across schools with high and low proportions of white students. And so these are the differences by race, right? And as we might expect, Black respondents who attended predominantly white schools, so the yellow line this time, experienced faster rates of increase in depressive symptoms, resulting in higher levels of depressive symptoms across the majority of this early and middle adulthood range. And we can compare this to their Black counterparts who attended low proportion white schools in this green line, who again experienced lower levels of depressive symptoms. And then white respondents who attended low proportion white schools, this blue line, experienced trajectories similar to their Black counterparts at similar schools. So here are the trajectories for respondents who attended high proportion white schools by skin color. And what we're seeing here is relatively disadvantaged trajectories among respondents rated as having medium brown skin, right? As this group experiences steady increases in symptoms across adulthood. And interestingly, we see that respondents rated as having light or dark brown skin report higher initial levels of depressive symptoms relative to whites and other skin color groups. and that those rated as having very dark brown skin, right, this red line, experience fewer initial depressive symptoms than their Black counterparts of different skin shades. But again, all skin color groups consistently have higher depressive symptoms than their white counterparts when they attended high proportion white schools. And then these are the trajectories among those who went to low proportion white schools. And so these trajectories are similar to the ones we saw for high proportion Black schools, right? In which those rated as having very dark brown skin experience more depressive symptoms with age, while those having very light brown skin experience an initial disadvantage in depressive symptoms that wanes with age. And then the trajectories for those rated as having medium or dark brown skin fall in between those rated as having light and very dark brown skin. Okay, so I'm going to try to concisely sum up, because I know that was a lot of results that I just threw at you, and they're relatively complex. And so overall, the results suggest that compared to whites and Black respondents who attended schools with lower proportions of Black students, Black respondents who attended predominantly Black schools experienced fewer depressive symptoms across adulthood. But there were more favorable trajectories experienced among the middle skin color categories, right? Because remember that Black respondents rated as having light skin started off with pretty high depressive symptoms when they attended high proportion Black schools. And those rated as having very dark brown skin experienced more depressive symptoms across adulthood, particularly in the later years. And then conversely, Black respondents who attended predominantly white schools experienced more depressive symptoms across adulthood. But we also saw more variation in patterns of advantage and disadvantage here, with Black respondents rated as having medium brown skin, experiencing more depressive symptoms towards the early 30s and later, while those rated as having light or darker brown skin experienced initial disadvantages that waned with age. So what might be going on here, right? And so this is something that still thinking through. But one possible explanation, again, goes back to these inter and intra-group dynamics that might differentially work to shape health. Right, so if we go back to the heterogeneous race model, we know that social identities can be made more or less salient depending on the racial context. Right, so when individuals are surrounded by members of a similar social group, right, so like Black respondents attending predominantly Black schools, they might draw on alternative identities or categories to create in-groups and out-groups, right? And use these as a way to navigate their social spaces. And so the construction and the consequences of these groupings might create situations in which there are more negative interactions between groups who are pretty different from each other, right? Leading to a unique set of risks and resources. Right? So that those of dark and very light brown skin might be treated more negatively in predominantly Black schools, given the types of stereotypes that have been assigned to those in these categories. And there's support for this possibility, right? So an article that came out in AJS from Ellis Monk showed that dark-skinned Black Americans and light-skinned Black Americans actually report similar levels of discrimination due to their skin color when that discrimination is coming from other Black individuals, right? And both of which are higher than the levels of discrimination reported among their medium skin counterparts. And so another possibility which might explain these initial disadvantages among lighter skinned Black respondents in particular is that navigating these types of contexts in early life also shape the types of behaviors or coping resources that are developed and activated in the face of hardships across adulthood, right? So things like racial identity, sense of mastery or worth, sensitivity to discrimination, right? Things like that. And so messages of self-pride or self-esteem, for example, could be preached or reinforced among darker skinned Black Americans, just given knowledge of how colorism and racism, right, might come to affect them, right? And these early life experiences might lead to differences in how Black Americans of different skin shades navigate life. But given stressful processes of socioeconomic achievement, particularly among darker skinned Black Americans, these consequences might actually wane over time. So just some future plans to explore these relationships. One, of course, is looking at some mechanisms that could link school contexts to health across adulthood. And I've already taken a look at a few mechanisms, so socioeconomic achievement, psychosocial factors, and school level factors. And at least preliminary results suggest that socioeconomic achievement and psychosocial factors, right, things like perceived stress, unfair treatment, feelings that people dislike you, they're helping to account for these higher levels of depressive symptoms at later ages for dark skinned respondents who attended high proportion white schools. But we actually don't have a lot of mechanisms that are likely important, right? So one big thing being racial identity, which can change over time and may actually vary by skin color, but there's not a whole heap of research on that. But there is certainly reason to believe that identity might be differentiated among Black Americans. And then, of course, importantly, in-group discrimination based on skin color is not measured in a lot of studies, but including ad health, right? And we know this kind of in-group discrimination can have significant consequences for mental health, right? So just as another example, in a new study by Hans O and colleagues, they found that it was in-group colorism that predicted lifetime psychiatric disorders among Black respondents, right? Whereas out-group colorism, right? So these experiences of discrimination from whites was not significantly related to the risk of lifetime psychiatric disorders, right? But really, it was the effect of in-group colorism that mattered. Other plans include examining other health outcomes like self-rated health or BMI, which are two measures that have been consistently assessed across all 5 ways of ad health. And then the skin tone composition of schools, right? So whether it's something above and beyond the racial composition, perhaps the skin tone composition of schools also might be influencing some of these patterns. And then I just want to point out that other early life contexts, as well as later life contexts, are very important to pay attention to. So I do recognize that schools are just one space that individuals navigate in childhood and adolescence, and they work in tandem with other contexts, such as the neighborhood or community. And though that kind of interaction could be playing a role in these patterns as well. And then, of course, later life contexts, whether it be at the neighborhood level, work level, right, likely are influencing some of these patterns. And then thinking about differences by gender, since we know that mental health in particular is a pretty gendered outcome, right, especially with an outcome like depressive symptoms. And so I just want to leave you with just some final thoughts. And so results from this paper suggest that multiple dimensions of race and inequality are consequential for health and well-being, right? And so these kinds of findings have implications for how we can or how we should measure race and assess racial inequality, right? Because the intersections of racism and colorism that were alluded to here may produce lived experiences in which race and racial inequality don't mean the same thing for all minoritized groups. And then on a similar note, the results suggest that social inequality is not experienced equally by all members of the Black American population, and that social advantages and disadvantages are not homogeneous or static across spaces, right? So these findings also suggest that embodying multiple identities is accompanied by various degrees of power and oppression in different contexts. And then the last thought is how we might harness or distribute these protections, right, that could be experienced in predominantly Black spaces for minoritized populations, right? As well as thinking about how we mitigate the increased risks that are experienced in predominantly white spaces. So with that, I'll just acknowledge AdHealth and open it up for questions and discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hargrove, for that great talk. It looks like we have some questions coming in the chat. Again, feel free to either raise your hand or come in the chat and we will call on you. So let's see. First, we have Esmeralda. Would you like to read out your question?
Sure. So I actually had 3 questions. Thank you, Dr. Hargrove, for your very interesting talk. So my first question was actually related to the sample, and I know you mentioned this during the presentation. So why was the sample restricted to whites and Blacks? And did you also mention that they were US born whites and Blacks? And if so, how do you think perhaps place of birth may affect some of these associations?
Absolutely. Yeah, so thank you for that question. So the restriction to US born respondents was intentional. Mainly for theoretical reasons, right? So we know that both white and Black individuals born outside of the US could have been exposed to or become accustomed to different types of stratification systems, ones that either relied more on skin color or perhaps relied more on things like religion, ethnicity, and nativity as well. So I wanted to be able to kind of cut down on that potential variation in terms of how people are interacting in these stratification systems, as well as the fact that there are very few white and Black respondents who were foreign born in the AdHealth cohort. So another reason is data driven, but it really, even if they were available, if we had a larger sample of foreign born Black and white respondents in AdHealth, I'd probably still restrict to US born just because of those different, perspectives and kind of worldviews. And then didn't include Hispanics because there's also just so much heterogeneity that exists among the Latino population. And I think this paper was already doing so much that kind of added another level of complexity that I don't think I would do justice in terms of trying to disentangle. And so kind of the first set or go through for this project is just looking at white and Black Americans, but also, being very cognizant of the fact that these patterns could also apply to Latino populations or could look different, right? But I would also want to be able to look at same race schools. And so I don't know that we would have the power to really find significant differences in predominantly Hispanic schools within the AdHealth cohort. So again, both a mix of theory and data restrictions.
And then related to my first question, it's number 3 in the chat. It was related to mixed race individuals. So did you exclude those individuals from your sample as well, or?
No, so that's a great question. So they're included. So the way AdHealth asked the questions about racial identity is they allowed respondents to choose however many racial categories that they identified with. And then they had a question that if you chose multiple racial categories, which group do you most identify with? And so they were forced to choose just one category. And so I used that in the event that individuals chose multiple racial groups. I used that question to determine whether they were included in the Black American sample, white sample, or were eventually excluded. So it's very possible that the lighter skinned respondents are those who are bi or multiracial.
And then I had one last question. I don't want to take too much time, but my last question was related to the skin color categories as well. So Were there any, I guess, parameters set up to try to disentangle? Maybe one interviewer might perceive the individual as medium colored skin versus another individual that might perceive that same individual as a darker colored skin. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's another great question. And unfortunately, there weren't any kind of protocols or procedures to account for that. But I can also tell you about the limitations of this measure. One being that we do know from prior research that perceptions of skin color differ by racial groups, such that the perception of one skin color that a Black interviewer might assign could be very different of the assignment of skin color from a white interviewer, even though it's the same person. And so they tried to race match the interviewer and respondent in Ad Health, but that didn't always occur. And I believe most of the respondents were, most of the interviewers were white. So there's a considerable amount of Black respondents who were interviewed by white individuals. And so there could be some messiness around kind of these true perceptions of skin color. But on the flip side, it also is some indication of how the majority of individuals in the US are viewing that person, right? So white Americans are still the numerical majority in the US. And so just in terms of numbers, right, it's a good indication of how a lot of people in society are viewing that person, but it's not the perfect measure at all.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Looks like we have another question in the chat from Kadise. Would you like to read out your question?
Yes. I was interested in, and I don't know if you have knowledge about their parents, but would you anticipate any differences in depressive symptoms in Black individuals who are US born but have parents that are immigrants?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's totally possible, right? In terms of the socialization that they receive from their parents could be very different than their peers who are engaging in socialization practices, but were born in the US, right? So again, going back to thinking about the types of stratification systems, or just systems of inequality that exist in different global contexts, right? And how that has to be adjusted once coming to the US. As we know, individuals who are born outside the US are forced into our stratification systems and hierarchies, whether they want to be or not. And so there still could be some differences in the perceptions of how things like racism or colorism work in the US, right? And so thinking about, again, the socialization practices that a foreign-born parent might give their child versus a US-born parent. And so because the US-born parent has their specific set of experiences, it might be kind of, I don't know if more relevant is the word, but perhaps is preparing the child better for experiences specifically in the US. So all that to say, yes, I do think we could see some differences between parents, those with parents who are US born versus foreign born. Thanks.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
I had a question. In looking across ages as you did, I'm wondering if you thought about any other racialized institutions that folks in the sample might have encountered and how their schooling could have set the stage for what institutions they go into, since we saw such dramatic differences in midlife.
Yeah, absolutely. So one big context is that of work, right? And occupations, which we don't have the best data in Ad Health on, but absolutely, right? So we know in US society, and given structural racism, right, Black and white individuals are funneled into different types of occupations, right, with their own varying racial compositions. And so absolutely, I think we'd see some really interesting patterns looking at Black students who went to predominantly Black schools, but are now in predominantly white occupations versus Black students who went to predominantly white schools and continue to be in predominantly white work institutions. So I think work is a huge one, as well as neighborhood, right? So neighborhood's a big, important context, not only in early life, but throughout one's life course. And so even though mobility is, or at least the characteristics of neighborhoods that people are moving into are kind of stable, particularly among Black Americans, there could certainly be some influences of moving to kind of qualitatively different types of neighborhoods. So I think work in neighborhoods. Thanks.
This is not a question, just a comment. Great work. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all the work you've done on similar topics.
Thanks for citing me. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Other questions from our audience? Oh, looks like we've got, okay. Is that, Gadisa, is your hand up?
Yeah, I don't want to take any time from others who may have questions.
Go ahead.
But I'm just interested if there's literature on like colorism over time. So like how the socio-political culture and climate changes different ideologies about dark skin versus medium skin versus light skin. For example, now, I would just hypothesize that maybe there are a little bit more positive representation of darker skinned individuals, especially in the media. And so I'm wondering if that changes folks' vulnerability to colorism across life, depending on when they grew up and the specific time period.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So there's actually a piece by Eric Gullickson in Social Forces in, I believe, 2005. It's actually titled The Declining Significance of Color. And what he did was building on growing research around colorism and stratification, particularly within socioeconomic status. And he did cohort analyses essentially and showed that in more recent cohorts, skin color was essentially less predictive of things like higher levels of educational attainment, income. And I believe those are the two major outcomes that he found significant cohort differences from. And so the argument there is that kind of the change in the racial kind of climate and schema that happened around the civil rights era, also World War II time where, the US was fighting Nazi racism. All those things culminated into a context where it was essentially Black individuals had to mobilize to gain racial equality rather than color. And so the argument is kind of in that context, race trumped skin color in terms of thinking about and dealing with inequality, because Black Americans had to, again, mobilize to fight, for civil rights and for equity and justice. And there was a recent paper, again, at Social Forces, right, by Ellis Monk, that showed kind of this continuing significance of skin color that uses more recent data. And so the argument there is, yes, we have changing socio-political context, but colorism essentially has never gone away. And in fact, people are much more able to kind of explicitly stop discriminating in terms of racial identity and racial stereotyping, and less likely to do that when it comes to skin color. And so there is some work, it's relatively older, but I think, it would be really interesting to see now with kind of these revived and sustained, social movements, right? Like the Black Lives Matter movement, whether that could be changing.
Yeah, thank you so much. Super interesting.
All right. Are there any other questions or comments for Dr. Hargrove?
Hi, I actually just came up with a question. This was an awesome talk. It was really fascinating. I was wondering if you had thought about also, so you have the different skin tone and then interacting that with gender. I thought like I read something in the New York Times a few years ago that like some of the income mobility differences were driven between race were driven by Black men, whereas Black women didn't quite have that same difference. So I was just curious if, if there's a reason you didn't do gender, or if that's next on your list of interactions.
Yeah, an excellent point. It is on the list of next interactions, especially because there's already evidence of kind of the gendered nature of colorism in general. So thinking about how, because skin complexion, right, lighter skin is this attribute of beauty, and beauty is already this form of capital for women in today's society. The argument is that skin color can be more consequential for the life chances of women compared to men. So that's definitely kind of a natural extension of looking towards gender interactions with gender. But again, I think the paper is doing a lot. And I'm still thinking of ways to really try to make it compact and concise, but absolutely thinking about the role of gender in these particular patterns, because again, we also know that depressive symptoms, right, tend to already be higher among women compared to men, because they are, women are more likely to internalize or have internalizing forms of distress, like depressive symptoms and anxiety, whereas men are more likely to have externalizing forms of distress, things like alcohol use. And so we might also see something different if the outcome of kind of mental health and well-being changed as well. Thanks.
Well, I have a question. Could you tell us a little more about, some of the, maybe like the next steps just right after this? I know you're talking about some of the, the possibilities because of the complexities of these various intersections. Kind of what's your next step right after this?
Yeah, so the next step, as the question we just posed, is gender. So seeing if there's enough statistical power to stratify the models by gender and see if there are any differences there. It's totally possible. So my other work has shown that disparities in health, skin color disparities in health really were only observed among women. And so there were less among men. So I think it would be interesting to see the extent to which that applies here, especially thinking about trends over the life course. And then even more immediate is really digging into these mechanisms, right? And thinking more seriously about which types of factors and measures could be important for these types of patterns, and trying to be a bit more creative given what's available in ad health, but really thinking about not only socioeconomic achievement, but different forms of coping resources that are available in the data.
That was going to be my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Given like the data limitations or challenges, we all face those. And thinking, kind of going back to one of the points you made earlier, thinking about like racial identity and some of these other like psychosocial factors, are there any kind of racial socialization or related dimensions in ad health that could be considered?
Not yet. I think that's going to change for wave 6 when it's fielded, I believe, this summer. There's been a lot more attention to the mechanisms for explaining racial disparities, geographical disparities, right? Gender, sexual identity types of disparities. But, in terms of the current measures that are available, there are some measures of discrimination and stress, but really nothing to kind of get at socialization practices or like Black consciousness, right, as racial identity, rather than just, which group do you identify with. And so for that, I think, also thinking about other data sets, right? So I know like the Nashville stress and health data has a lot of great measures of like unique stressors. So of course you would know better than I would, but perhaps looking into different types of data sources that could help, parse out some of these patterns.
Awesome. Future collaborations.
There we go.
Related to your point about potential sex or gender differences, some of the papers have shown that in the presence of same amount of discrimination, Black males may take discrimination to substance use or depression with a significant interaction compared to the other sex or gender. And Black female may take it to obesity given their environment or what is easier to coping with. So there are like 4 or 5 papers showing that discrimination, same amount, interacts with sex gender to opposite directions for these 2 sets of outcomes, obesity related and then mental health related outcomes. That is one. And then there is a little bit of, because now you are thinking more seriously about sex gender differences, another line of thinking is the domain, like devaluation related versus threat based, because if there is a sex or gender specific effect of skin tone, then for Black men or Black boys, dark hair may be closely related to threat, perception of threat, and then for Black women or girls might be through devaluation. That some research supports that. So this again, it becomes extremely messy so fast, because now it is not the same discrimination. It is threat-based discrimination, devaluation-based discrimination. The process differs, but ABCD dataset has collected discrimination and a lot of these emotion regulation stuff, substance use and everything. So I am currently using the ABCD data and some discrimination. And so just, you may also consider that in addition to fragile families, FATS, Mark Zimmerman Flint adolescent study, these have all collected data, as you know, on these measures, and you might be able to use for your sex gender difference comparison.
Yeah, thank you so much for pointing me to these types of findings, which are, I think, very intriguing and kind of off bat, makes sense. Like when you said, discrimination tends to manifest through obesity for women and girls versus alcohol use disorders for men and boys. I think that's also, very gendered and just in terms of the outcomes. And so that makes sense that that's how those kinds of experiences are coped with and ultimately come to effect. And really interesting about the devaluation versus threat-based types of discrimination. Super interesting.
Yeah, good luck with your next research.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So.
All right. Are there any other questions? We just have just a few minutes left. Any last questions or comments? All right. Well, we're going to say thank you so much to Dr. Hargrove for a really great talk, for sharing your work and sparking a really great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much again for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And also, as a quick reminder for students, please feel free to stay on this Zoom link for the pro seminar that goes until 2 p.m. if you want to ask Dr. Hargrove any additional questions, or if you have comments about the presentation or your own research and you would like to share, please stay on this Zoom link.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Hargrove.
Okay. See ya. I'll talk to you later.
All right. So I see 5 people, but I know some of us are staff members. So I just want to go ahead and maybe wait 30 seconds for everyone to log off if you're not going to be participating in the pro seminar, but if you are, please stay on. And before we begin, let me go ahead and add the attendance link in the chat so you can get some credit as well for attending the pro seminar. So just make sure to sign in and select the pro seminar option. And okay, it's now in the chat. So before we start, just to give Dr. Hargrove a quick overview of how the pro seminar usually runs. It's quite informal. We start off with some quick round of introductions where people introduce themselves, and then it's open to any questions or comments, and it goes until 2 p.m. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and log off, but I will, if you have any questions, feel free to just send me an email for any reason. Thank you for your presentation. It was great.
Yes, thank you.